All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Our objective for today, same one as yesterday, is that students will be able to create a table, equation, graph, and written description to model a visual pattern. So if you remember yesterday, we were working on this visual pattern here that involved the number of squares increasing as the case number increased, right? Yesterday you made a table and you made a written description to describe it. Today we're going to work on making an equation, figuring out what the equation means, even though it's simple, and then working on graphing it. Okay, so first thing that we're going to do today is we're going to try to make an equation. All right, so the reason why we make an equation is so that we can predict future values without having to draw it out. Now, this example is easy enough that you could probably figure it out without an equation, but we're going to go through the process so that you understand when you have to do this for yourself. Okay, so first thing when you're making an equation is just kind of identifying some variables that you're going to use, right? Remember, a variable is really just a placeholder for something. So we're going to say that the letter S is going to represent the number of squares that we have in any particular case, and the number N is going to represent what case we're currently on, right? So if I'm on, like, say, case 5, case 5 would actually mean that N equals 5. My pen is lagging, right? Case 10 would mean N equals 10. So the idea is that when we have our equation, if you know the current case number, the equation tells you how many squares that you should have. So what the relationship ends up being here is that we know the number of squares in any case is going to have to be equal to whatever the case number is, right? So case number 5 is going to have 5 squares. Case number 10 is going to have 10 squares. So if you're given the case number, you can tell that that's just going to be the same as the number of squares, right? Now, that relationship you should have noticed yesterday when we looked at this table, right? Case number 1 had 1 square. Case number 5 had 5 squares. So case number 13 would have 13 squares. So this example is pretty easy. The equation is simple. It's just that S is equal to N, right? The idea for the next part is just to try to use that equation to figure out some numbers, right? In this case here, it should be pretty simple because you know that they're the same, right? But the idea is if you were doing this for something that was a little bit more complex, I'll show you how that would work. We would say, okay, so case number 15, sorry, that pen is really weird right now. Case number 15 would tell us that, okay, I have N is my case number, so N equals 15. I know that the number of squares is equal to N, and then I would basically substitute this value of 15 in for N, so that tells us that the number of squares that I must have is equal to 15. Again, this case is pretty simple, but just an example, right? Just so you guys can get the idea. Let's say we had a different scenario where it looked something like, say, the number of squares was equal to, say, the case number plus 3 extra squares, right? And then in this case, I was talking about, case number 15. I would do the same thing. I would say, okay, so let's substitute in the value of 15 in for N. So the number of squares is equal to, and this substitution is something that we've done before, 15 plus 3. So in that case, I would say, okay, so the 15th case needs to have 18 squares in it. That's kind of how that works. So use that information to just fill out this part. Remember, using this equation here, this is just a different example for some other case that we might have had. All right. Now pause the video, just go through that part. Once you're done, the next part I'm going to try to help walk you through is again using this online graph tool. So the idea here is to try to make a graph, paste it in here. All right, we've done this a couple of times in the past. The idea is you want to click on this link here. All right, this should take you directly to the graph that you need. We're gonna give it a second to load up. The only thing you have to remember when you go to this site is to make sure that you're looking at the XY graph. So you see up here, for me, it says graph equals XY. You see right here that I selected XY. Now you're gonna scroll down. You can leave all this stuff blank here. Hit next. This section here, you give your titles. So the x-axis is your independent variable. The independent variable that we identified was the case number. The y-axis that we identified was the number of squares. Now, you need to go down here where it says data set. We're plotting 10 points, change that to 10. And then one by one, you're just gonna enter in your points here. So your x value, your y value, and just remember, they're all the same here. So case number 1, x, this is like x here. This one's like y here. So 1, 1, 2, 2. So when you're putting these points in, when x is 1, y is 1. When x is 2, y is 2. When x is 3, y is 3, and so on. Do that up to 10. You hit next, next again, you're gonna get your graph. I'm not gonna put all those points in for you, but your graph is gonna look something like this. You have the labels, number of squares, case number, copy your image, and then once you have it, come back here, paste it into this box, and you're gonna be done, all right? And then just to talk about why we make this graph, right? This is just another way of representing some information, all right? So what this could tell me, right, is I could say, okay, so like if I'm talking about case 1.4, how many squares should we have there, right? We can use a graph to try to predict some future values, and it's just a different way of looking at the same exact information that you have on your table, right? So this is a way of looking at that information with numbers. This is a way of looking at that information with a graph, right? Different ways of expressing the same information. Now, lastly, what you're gonna do for today is I want you to try and push yourself to come up with your own patterns, all right? So it says use the next 2 pages to create your own linear pattern. The number of squares should increase by the same amount from case to case. So just think, right? Where are you starting at case 0? How many squares do you want to have? How many squares are you going to add on to case 1? And you can have whatever patterns you want. Try to get creative, right? You're going to want to add 1 square each time, 2 squares. Where are you adding the squares? Get creative. And then at the bottom, I want you to try to come up with an equation to represent the number of squares at each case number. All right, that's it for today. I will see you at the Zoom session later today.